My name is Rochelle Chaparruiz, and today we will be unpacking TEKS 19B. This presentation is associated with Educational Leadership, Course 6350. This is the agenda that we will be utilizing today throughout this presentation. As you can see, it has the different topics that we'll be covering and with the slides associated with them. On this slide, we have data dissected from our Texas Academic Performance Report for the campus of Del Mar Salinas STEM Early College High School. This data is based from 2017 to 2018 on STAR performance. Now, we dissected this report and are focusing exclusively on all grades, ELA, and reading. Based upon our data, we identified that from 2017 to 2018, we had a 2% decrease. If you look at the state, district, and campus percentages, you'll notice that the campus is performing above district and state performances. However, the 2% decrease is still enough of a concern for us to have identified. So, based upon that, we're going to focus this unpacking of TEKS on our ELA and reading. Here we have an example of TEKS score item analysis. The questions that you'll see here have standards that are associated with figure 19B, which is the TEKS we are unpacking today. Based upon this, you can see our current percentages for the correct answers. This next slide also offers us more questions with more percentages on here. You can see question 33, the percent correct, 76%, 89%, 76, 78. As we move on to the next slides, we'll begin to see a decrease in mastery below 70%. This next slide also shows us which questions had standards that associated 19B, and of course the percentages associated with those. Now on these next questions, 28 and 32, you may notice the yellow highlight. This is due to the fact that the yellow indicates mastery below 70%. So on this 19B, on this standard, the students for this question scored 54%, and the other question, question 32, 67%. On this chart, I went ahead and made it so that we can have an idea of how many questions actually pertain to TEKS 19B. Out of the 53 questions that the students received on their 9th grade English 1 benchmark, we identified 15 of those were specifically from TEKS 19B. 15 of those questions out of 53 is 28%. So that's a significant number of questions that the students are being introduced to. And so it's best that we do cover and ensure that the students are mastering these TEKS so that they can be prepared for their next assessment. Here we have figure 19, which is in reference to TEKS 19B. As you can see, we have English 1, 2, 3, and 4 listed, but we are going to go ahead and focus on English 1 today. For English 1, TEKS 19B, students use a flexible range of metacognitive reading skills in both assigned and independent reading to understand an author's message. Students will continue to apply earlier standards with greater depth in increasingly more complex texts as they become self-directed, critical readers. The student is expected to A. reflect on understanding to monitor comprehension, and B. make complex inferences about text and use textual evidence to support understanding. Based upon subcategories A and B, we're going to go ahead and focus on the words reflect, monitor comprehension, make inferences, and use. On subsection A, we're going to focus on reflect and monitor comprehension. We want to make sure that the students are understanding what it is we're explaining to them. Now, we can do this in the form of asking questions, summarizing, synthesizing, making connections, and creating sensory images. So by doing all these things, this is a great way to monitor the comprehension that the students did in fact understand the lesson. In subsection B, we have make, inferences, and use. We want to make sure that the students are making inferences, since that is primarily what this TEK is based upon, making inferences, and which is a struggle for some of our students, especially in the ninth grade area. So if we can have the students use textual evidence to support understanding, they'll be able to make these inferences throughout their literary selections. In dissecting the content, we're going to monitor comprehension. We do this in the form of asking questions, summarizing and synthesizing, making connections, and creating sensory images. Now, when we give the students a literary selection, it's always great to ask questions as we go along, so we can make sure that the students are comprehending what it is we're teaching them through this TEK. So asking questions throughout the literary selection, it's a great way to guide the students into what it is we want them to focus on. And if we do this consistently and regularly, eventually the students will be reading and they'll be able on their own to make these little details and to guide themselves to make these inferences, which is what we want. Now, summarizing and synthesizing, it's a great way also, because if they read a couple of lines from their literary selection, then okay, you know what, we're going to read lines 1 through 7. It's a great way for them to stop and summarize what it is they just read, so that we're making sure that what they're reading, they are comprehending. So they're not just reading it just to get through the selection. They're actually comprehending as they go what it is that they read. Making connections is absolutely wonderful in the high school area, I've noticed, because if we can have the students relate to something on a level that's at their level, if the students are making a connection between something that they read in an article and something that they go through in their personal or their daily lives, it's a great way for the students to begin to understand what it is that they're reading and how they can interpret what's going on in the story to a real world situation. And maybe it doesn't even have to be something that they're personally going through, but just dissecting from what it is that they're reading and making that connection to a real world inference or a real world example is great for the students to be able to identify what it is that they've read throughout. And of course, creating sensory images. We want the students to understand what it is that they're reading. And I mean, we're trying to do this in all these ways of questions, summarizing, making connections. But it's important that they do all these steps to get there, so that they can have that picture in their head of what it is that they actually read, that they're part of the story, that they understand what's going on through their literary selections. Making complex inferences, we're going to use textual evidence to support the understanding. So we don't just want the students to say, oh, well, like, why did this happen? We have to have a reason. We need textual evidence to support that reason. Well, because in paragraph 8, it said this. And so we want them to be able to refer back to that. So as the students are reading, if they're comprehending what it is they're reading, they're going to remember, in this paragraph, it said this. And we want them to go back to that, because that's the evidence that's going to help support their answer when they're giving the answer choices. They have 4 different answer choices to choose from, and they'll be able to go through each one. And you know what? The textual evidence that I have from this paragraph and this line supports this statement. So it's a great way for us to show the students to back up their answers. Use textual evidence. Here we have a sample question from one of our past STAR assessments, English 1. Question 24 states, paragraphs 7 and 8 are important to the development of the plot because they, and the correct answer is F. because the author's reaction to the apple's taste provides an unexpected ending to the story, further developing the plot. The narrator includes details in paragraphs 7 and 8 to provide evidence that although he and his daughter expected the apples would taste good, the apples did not match their expectations. Now, this question is a perfect example as to why it is important for the students to have textual evidence. Question 24 is giving us the paragraphs 7 and 8. It's specifically telling us where to go look for the answer. So if we're able to explain to the students while they're reading their literary selection, paragraphs 7 and 8, they can go ahead. It's identified here in question 24. Go back to that and review it, and it's important to have textual evidence from there. If students are able to dissect the textual evidence from those paragraphs, they'll have the correct answer there. So it's just doing that little bit of extra work, and you'll have the right answer. So it's important that we emphasize the importance of textual evidence to be able to help them make these inferences. Comprehension is a process that teachers can model for students through an effective lesson framework. Now for the reading process before, establish purposes, make inferences, ask questions, make connections. This is exactly what our TEKS is telling us. Now for teaching process, the preparation for this, what are you going to do before the reading to help your students to do these things? What do they need to know about the text in order to do these things? So this is why it's important that as the students are reading their literary selection, that they have those little notes that they make as they're reading. Normally what we do when we're giving the students a lesson, we give them a literary selection. We offer guided questions throughout and help the students get there. But what we eventually want the students to do is not so much rely on the teacher, but remember to look out for those little key points. So making sure that we have these guided questions already for the students as they're going to read, ask questions, make connections. It's a great way for the students to understand what it is that they are reading. Now we're going to monitor comprehension, ask questions again, summarize, make connections, make inferences. This is during the reading process. Now, what we're going to do is what are you going to do to provide or to assist the students in doing these? As an educator, what am I going to do to make sure that the students are understanding, summarizing, making connections? How are you going to model this? And what do you want them to focus on? These are all great questions we can ask, and of course, we're applying this to English, but it can be applied to any lesson in any core subject. What are we going to do to provide or to assist the students in doing these things? So things like guided questions as they're reading, having the students summarize what they read between paragraphs. We're going to model as we work on these assignments. It's great to have class assignments apart from having your independent studies for the students. If we're able to work on this as a class and the students are able to model and follow what it is that we were explaining, then eventually they'll understand how to do it and they'll be able to apply it on their own. So this is what we want to emphasize for them. We want them to learn how to get there. After, ask questions, summarize, make connections, make inferences. We're going to reflect how will the students use these skills to evaluate and analyze the text and their learning. How can you extend the learning? So these are all great questions to ask during the teaching process. Preparation, assistance, reflection. When we come up with the lesson, we don't just give them a lesson to do. It's just busy work. No, there's always a purpose behind the lesson. Of course, we want to master the TEKS, so we always want to include those in our lessons. But what are we going to do to make sure that the students are understanding the TEKS that we're explaining to them? So thinking about all these things prior to the assignments is a great way for us to make sure and to monitor for their comprehension. Were the students able to learn with this lesson? Maybe they need a hands-on lesson. Maybe they need more visuals. So of course, we want to try to offer the students as much help as possible in any way we can. So just continuously monitoring for comprehension, asking questions. We can never ask too many questions. Summarizing and having the students make those connections will eventually have the students be able to make these inferences on their own. Here we have a sample of an assignment that I wanted to discuss that is a great assignment that will pertain to TEKS 19B. This one in specific is Long Walk to Forever. It's a literary selection. Now here, as you can see, I discussed guided questions and you will note them here in blue. Don't forget, ask questions intended to guide the reader through the selection. So as the students are reading, it's important, if we're reading it all together as a class, asking these questions to ensure that the students are following along. Not just that they're listening to what everybody else is reading, but that they're actually comprehending what it is they're reading. So this is one of the students. It's a love story, so of course our freshman students love this story or love the idea of the story. So it appeals to them in that sense. So right off the bat, just with this literary selection, they're intrigued because it's about romance and it interests them to know what's going on. So we're going to go ahead for this TEK, and what we're going to suggest is selecting a literary selection. Now, the activity behind this literary selection is we dissected quotes from it, and these are just a few. Use the imagery from the story to create the setting and place your inferences along the walk or setting you create. Use complete sentences. So we dissected quotes from this literary selection, such as Catherine turned rosy thinking about rosy brides. So based upon this quote, what can you infer about? And then Catherine. So these questions right here will actually get the students thinking. They're thought-provoking questions that we can get the students going, and it's going to appeal to them in a sense that, well, because I read it in this paragraph or in this sentence, or I remember that the teacher asked this question, it must have been important because it was going to deal with this. So we're making these inferences without the students even knowing. So this is a great activity, and a reason why I love this activity as well is because this activity can be applied to any type of literary genre. Now, that is also something very important to consider when we discuss this TEK. Of course, this TEK is based upon inferences. If we focus solely on one genre, such as poetry, if the students receive a short story, fiction and nonfiction, they might not know how to apply those same techniques because they had only done it in poetry. So this activity works great with any genre of literature, which is, I think, something that's important that we should also remember, and I cannot specify enough, is that exposing the students to the different types of genres of literature is great because you don't know what is going to be on the STAR test. There is no specific answer as to what type of literary selection they will be receiving. So we want the students to be prepared. So if we give them a little bit of everything and teach them how to work to these inferences on any type of literary selection, then we'll know that when it comes time to testing, they already know how to do it. They're proficient in every literary selection that they'll get because they have these skills, because they applied making these inferences, making their notes, asking questions, summarizing. They'll be able to apply it into any literary genre, which is wonderful because that's what we want. In English, there's so many different ways that we can give the students assignments. And this way is a great way to cover all those genres. So activities like this are not just focused on this specific literary selection. It can be applied to any type. Thank you.